Good morning. I was trying to say good morning. Thank you. See? Good morning, class. How is everybody? A good hearty breakfast, right? All right, can we thank Westover Hills for the breakfast? Okay. So my name is Byron Cordes. I'm honorary chair of this committee. I say honorary because if you know Helen Flores, she did all the work. She had surgery this week, so she's not here. I do want to thank everybody for coming out on this beautiful day. We have a record number of attendees today. I think we had 420, 415. I'm looking for somebody who knows. Well, obviously we haven't filled it yet, so we're not there yet, but hopefully we'll get that. So I think that's just really indicative of the importance of the work that the Alzheimer's Association does. Of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, you guys know, but supporting caregivers, professionals, and of course folks afflicted with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. So we have a packed day. If you've seen your outline, then so I'm going to kick us off. I do want to say one quick word about what? You can't hear me? Thank you. Okay, how's that? Okay, do I need to repeat everything I said? Welcome to the committee. Okay, so I do want to say a quick word about the CEUs. So if you're here for continuing education, the SAGE table out front, SAGE care management table out front, you should have checked in there for nursing, social work, and then we're doing continuing education. We're doing certificates of attendance for anybody else, and you can try to claim those for your profession. So you should have gotten a separate sign-in sheet that you'll just need to give back to us that attests that you were here. If you're not staying the whole day, you can get partial credit. We have the evaluation of each speaker. So it's got a quick little Likert scale, circle how you think they did. And then you'll have your CEU certificate where you can also keep track on the back of the sessions that you attended. And you'll keep that and return the other two at the end of the day. Okay, it is my distinct honor now to hand off to Vivian Garza-Steele. She is the chair of the board of the San Antonio and South Texas chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, and just a wonderful lady.
Good morning. And welcome to the annual educational summit. As Byron said, I am the board chair for the Alzheimer's Association, San Antonio and South Texas. Before we get started, I want to thank Byron and his summit committee for all the hard work and dedication that they have to the summit. I think each year they raise the bar higher and higher. We might have to move to a different facility. Thank you, Byron. The names of his committee are also in your little brochure that you have. I also want to recognize and showcase a few of our chapter staff. Meg Barron, I think she is on her way, we hope. Meg is our executive director, and she's also the region lead for all the chapters in Texas, so she's a busy lady. Jenny Funk is running around here. She is our San Antonio program director. Maxine Vieira is our program director. From Austin. We also have a few board members here. Dr. Bob Gracie, Elaine Tolarski, and of course Byron is my vice chair. Throughout the day, if you have any questions about the Alzheimer's Association chapter, I encourage you to talk to these individuals. They can give you a lot of information about the association. All of us here today have a story about Alzheimer's and how it's affected us. My story is directly related to why I volunteer. There are two reasons. First and foremost, in honor of my mother, Esther, who passed away from Alzheimer's in 2016. She had Alzheimer's for over 20 years. Alzheimer's steals memories, and my work with the association helps keep her memory alive. Second, I'm a supporter of the Alzheimer's Association and an advocate to find a cure. Whether it's raising funds for research or raising awareness by telling my caregiving story, I help the Alzheimer's Association. I want to encourage you, each of you here today, to do the same thing. Keep your loved one's memory alive through volunteering and learning more to teach others about the disease. We can't beat this disease without your help. With that, I'd like to introduce our morning MC, Erica Zucco from KENS5. Erica is a reporter for KENS5 where she covers all kinds of stories and loves learning about life in San Antonio. She enjoys covering stories about families impacted by Alzheimer's, and she comes together with us to support one another and find a cure. You might recognize Erica from the Walk to End Alzheimer's. She helped us out last year. Here she is. Give her.
Thank you so much, and thank all of you for being here this morning. As Vivian mentioned, all of us have a story related to Alzheimer's. My grandmother had Alzheimer's. My mother was a caregiver for her for a few years. After that, she was in memory care, and I've seen the amazing and impactful work that caregivers do. So a lot of you in this room, it's amazing. So thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being here today to invest in this education and see what we can all learn together. We have a couple of housekeeping items we want to run through first. The outline for the day is in your program if you want to check that out and see where we're going next. Restrooms are going to be out that back door to the right and then to the left if anybody needs those. And we want to be sure to visit our wonderful resource tables around the room and in the hall. It's through their support that this conference is possible. And did everybody get a bingo card in your registration packet? Yeah. Okay, so that bingo card right there, you're going to want to visit these tables so you can check off the spots, and then you'll be able to enter a drawing for your prizes. We also want to give one more special thank you to Memory Care Westover Hills for breakfast. And did everybody see that big giant brain outside? Yeah, pretty cool. Has anybody had a chance to check it out yet? I haven't yet either, but it is an inflatable interactive brain from University Health System, and it's going to help explain Alzheimer's in a really visible way. So we're going to want to make sure that we check that out, and it's going to be in the courtyard until 1 o'clock. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who has traveled all the way from Chicago, Dr. Darren Gittleman, who will speak on lifestyle factors to reduce the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Darren Gittleman, MD, completed his undergraduate degree in chemistry summa cum laude and his medical degree at Washington University in St. Louis. He completed an internal medicine residency at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center and then went on to complete a one-year research fellowship in neuroimaging at the New York State Psychiatric Institute and Columbia University. Subsequently, he did a neurology residency, and he was also neurology chief resident at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He completed a behavioral neurology fellowship at Beth Israel in Boston and joined the neurology faculty at Northwestern University in 1994. He has over 90 publications, serves on 2 editorial boards, and is a reviewer on over 20 journals. He is now currently Senior Medical Director of the Advocate Memory Center, Professor of Neurology at Rosalind Franklin University, and Adjunct Associate Professor of Neurology and Radiology at Northwestern. Let's welcome Dr. Darren Gittleman.
Thank you. Good morning. Let me turn this on. Yes. Thank you for having me today. Thank you for being here, for all the sponsors, and thank you in particular for the Alzheimer's Association. We are up in Chicago working very closely with them on a number of projects now that will increasingly come to light in the next few months. So today, happy to present and talk a little bit about various lifestyle factors that we can all implement that may in the end help to reduce our risk of having dementia and Alzheimer's disease. The talk, I welcome questions during the talk if you have any. I think there'll be ample time at the end. I use a lot of science and graphs in the talk to make the point, so if anything is confusing, let me know. For people with CEUs, here are my disclosures. And here's the outline. So we'll talk a little bit about the background of Alzheimer's disease. You've heard a bit about it already and the devastation it creates. We'll talk a little bit about the patterns of aging that take place and why Alzheimer's disease is a deviation from that pattern. I will speak about some risk factors and interventions to mitigate and reduce those risk factors. And then why the current levels of evidence are not enough for us to know precisely how to prevent Alzheimer's disease, but more research is on the way. We'll talk about intervening in a variety of ways, and then some of the things that block us from doing, taking part in all the good habits we're supposed to. So to start, so what disease do we fear the most? So your parents, what disease did your parents worry about the most? Cancer, right? Everybody says cancer. But nowadays, in a poll, the disease we fear the most is Alzheimer's. And so partly why you hear so much about it in the press, so much research, and why, if I ask how many people here have had Alzheimer's disease touch their family, right? So many people have had Alzheimer's disease touch their family. There's a tremendous burden of the disease. Alzheimer's disease currently is thought to affect about 5.5 million people in the U.S. It is the most expensive disease in America, even though there are many more common diseases, heart disease, for example, and the costs are in excess of $250 billion a year, and that doesn't even count the caregiving costs and the toll on caregivers. It is the 5th leading cause of death among Americans. Here, this graph just shows where we are now. Let's see, down at around 4.5 to 5.5 million, and where we will be by the year 2050 if something is not done to halt the progression and development of Alzheimer's disease. Throughout the world, dementia is also distressingly common. 35.5 million people now have dementia, and that number rises to approximately, if you add up all the numbers, 70 million, again, by the year 2030. So let's talk about some patterns of cognitive aging. So this graph displays, as I'll show you, different life courses one might take in relation to cognitive functioning, thinking abilities, and years. So you'll notice that at the start, it's kind of a little bit higher over here, and as we begin life, our cognitive functioning may be good, and then it may progress and deteriorate over time. Here is one pathway, one cognitive pathway that one might take over one's life course, starting out at a normal or above average level perhaps, and then declining over the years, and eventually passing the threshold at which problems with thinking are interfering with daily life, which is what we call dementia. At this point, this would be roughly a little bit before 70 years old in this simulated graph. And what if we were able to have a different life course? So we start out very parallel, but at some point in midlife have some intervention that makes just a little bit of difference in terms of that person's life course. Now, the onset of dementia is delayed, perhaps even past when the person would naturally pass away, for example, and there's a delay of nearly 20 years with just a little bit of a change in midlife. And that's what the talk is about today. What can we do for ourselves throughout our earlier parts of our life to help delay and prevent dementia in the future? If we were able to delay the onset of dementia, and this graph shows a number of times of delay, from no delay all the way up to delaying the onset of dementia by 5 years. And if you were able to do that by nearly the year 2050, there would be a 50% reduction in the number of people with Alzheimer's disease, with only a delay of 5 years in the age of onset. So a delay is, in a sense, similar to a cure for many people. Now, when is it that we should intervene in one's life? And I show graphs here of normal aging and aging related to dementia and cognitive impairment. So at what point would we intervene? Well, we can try to intervene very early on, but the person would be very young and there would be many years of that intervention, which might be very tough to do. Of course, if we intervene near the end of life, the person has already passed on that threshold to dementia, and the intervention would not be necessarily effective. We could intervene at some point in the middle, and we'll talk a little bit about the science of when that might be most effective. Now, I'd like to take a little interlude to talk about just some of the pathology and biology of Alzheimer's disease. You'll hear about amyloid today. I'll speak a little bit about it in the talk. You'll hear about another protein called tau, and I think in other talks that are speaking about the science, they'll discuss this as well. Here is a cartoon representation of a nerve cell. I've shown you the cell membrane, and in the nerve cell membrane is a protein called amyloid, the amyloid precursor protein. We all have this in our brains. It has some natural function. Scientists don't quite know what that natural function is, but it may help protect neurons and help with neuronal growth. And that protein spans the membrane. There are several things that can happen to that protein as it's processed by the cell. It can be cut by enzymes that are called the alpha and gamma secretase. And when it does so, it forms harmless fragments that are non-toxic and easily disposed of by the cell. It can also be cut, and unfortunately most often cut, by what's called the beta secretase and gamma secretase. And when it does so, it forms an insoluble fragment. What you may have heard of is called beta amyloid. And that insoluble fragment then composes the plaques of Alzheimer's disease, which accumulate and are thought to, in a sense, ignite the fuse or other fuse that ignites further pathology in the disease. Here's a cartoon representation of nerve cells. Nerve cells communicate with each other. And that amyloid accumulates over time throughout the brain and also at points that interfere with the connections between the nerve cells or the synapses. We now know that these amyloid plaques interfere with the communication between nerve cells, kind of like cutting a wire in a telephone system. And the amyloid plaques also generate inflammation. And like inflammation that's run amok elsewhere in the body, that inflammation may further damage the nerve cells and the communication between them. So the accumulation of beta amyloid takes place early on in Alzheimer's disease, and that leads to an accumulation of another protein called tau. Now, what is tau? So nerve cells have microtubules. These are like the skeleton of the nerve cell or a scaffolding. And the microtubules allow transport across the microtubule. Nerve cells can be very long, for example. There are some nerve cells that might stretch from your motor cortex down to your spinal cord. And the nerve cell has to find a way to transport the neurotransmitters and other parts of the cell from one end to the other. Tau is a protein that helps to stabilize this microtubule, kind of like a scaffold. And in Alzheimer's disease, that tau is processed abnormally. A phosphate group is added to it, so we call it hyperphosphorylated tau. And when it does so, it cannot perform its usual scaffolding function, and the microtubules break apart. As you might imagine, that destroys the ability for the nerve cell to transport materials and damages the nerve cell itself. So the accumulation of beta amyloid may be toxic itself to the nerve cell and the synapses or the connection, and it leads to this abnormal processing of tau. The accumulation of tau damages nerve cells, and tau seems to be able to propagate itself throughout the brain. So once it starts in one place, it can spread to other places of the brain. There's inflammation involved. As nerve cells are damaged, they can release what we call excitatory neurotransmitters, kind of like the 10th cup of coffee for the day. You lose other neurotransmitters, so acetylcholine is a brain neurotransmitter. It is actually one of the targets to boost in the only available medications we have for Alzheimer's disease. And there is an impaired signaling, an impaired communication between nerve cells and a breakdown of the networks of the brain leading to dementia. So when we hear about amyloid or tau that I speak of, this is the process that's taking place. Now, Alzheimer's disease is, if I had to ask you when Alzheimer's disease starts, is a disease of old age or middle age? Who says old age? See, everybody's read the bulletin. So who says middle age? Yeah, unfortunately, right? We all thought that Alzheimer's disease, we all see older people who have Alzheimer's disease, and we think Alzheimer's disease originally was a disease of old age. But research in the last decade or two has shown that it really starts many, many years before we are old, unfortunately. So here's a graph, and I wanted to show you the y-axis here, what they call a difference, and it's just going to show how things change over time. And on this x-axis, the bottom here, this horizontal axis, the estimated years to the symptom onset. And time 0 is when the person would be diagnosed with dementia. People sometimes say to me, do I have Alzheimer's disease or dementia? So remember that dementia is the set of symptoms such that the person's impaired thinking is interfering with their daily life. Kind of like an umbrella term. Many things cause dementia. Alzheimer's is unfortunately the most common cause as we get older, but you can have strokes causing dementia, certain brain infections cause dementia, there are other types of degenerative disorders that cause dementia, and so on. So this would be time 0 when dementia is diagnosed. MCI stands for mild cognitive impairment, and it's a time when there's a little bit of change in cognition, but the person is still independent in their daily lives. And so we have the point at which, we'll call this the point at which the clinical symptoms become apparent. When you visit the doctor would be able to give you some thinking tests and know that you are having symptoms of impairment in your thinking and dementia, and also when either you yourself or more often your family might notice that there are beginning to be some changes in thinking. So we have 10 years before symptom onset, 20 and 30 years. And they find that that beta amyloid begins to accumulate. It changes from 0 about 25 years before the onset of the clinical symptoms of the disease, 25 years. So if your onset was scheduled to be around 70 and you're developing Alzheimer's disease, by 45, that amyloid has begun its march to accumulate in the brain and trigger the other problems of the disease. That protein tau, which damages the neurons, that begins at about 15 years before the onset of the clinical symptoms. Hippocampal volume. The hippocampus is a structure in the brain intimately involved with memory. Its shrinkage goes along with an impairment in memory, and you can see that shrinkage starts at about the time that tau begins to accumulate and damage the nerve cells. So the shrinkage is related to the loss of the nerve cells in the hippocampus. And then finally, the CDR is a cognitive and functional measure. Anyone who's been involved in research in Alzheimer's will know about the clinical dementia rating scale, and it's a scale that asks about the person's orientation, memory, community activities, judgment, personal care, and so on. And a higher score on that indicates more abnormality, And you can see that after amyloid has accumulated, the tau has accumulated, the nerve cells are damaged, then the CDR begins to increase, showing a decline in the person's thinking abilities and eventual diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now, I want you to notice in the graph that at the point where the dementia is diagnosed, what's happened to the beta amyloid at that point? Well, it's really at the peak, isn't it? It's already risen to its highest level. Tau is nearly at its highest level. And that suggests that at the time we make the clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, these abnormal proteins have already substantially accumulated in the brain. So now let's think about when would we intervene? When could we do something about all these changes taking place? Well, primary prevention would be before any of the changes start. But that would have to take place at least 30 years before whenever one's disease might have an onset. Secondary prevention, the window for that is a large window when there are some changes that take place, but perhaps you can do something to delay what's going on in the brain and change those graphs to be maybe a gentler slope, so it takes longer for the disease to onset. Tertiary prevention, or not prevention, really symptomatic treatment, is when the symptoms have already started and progressed through mild, moderate to severe dementia. Unfortunately, the only therapies we have now start at the tertiary prevention phase. So when you hear about the donepezil or memantine, for example, those drugs are used when people already have dementia. They're not preventative drugs, they're symptomatic treatment, and they're used throughout all the phases of dementia, mild, moderate, and severe. But they're not changing the underlying pathology of the disease. Perhaps we could intervene before dementia, right before dementia really starts, when people come in with symptoms, and that is the strategy being taken by a lot of drug trials today. Many of those drug trials were intervening when people already had dementia in the early 2000s, and they figured out through the failure of those drug trials that unfortunately that was too late. Now drug trials are trying to start earlier, a few years earlier, and hopefully intervening again before too many of the symptoms are present. But maybe we'd really like to intervene before amyloid and tau have reached their peaks. This would be early on, and there are a number of prevention trials. And when we talk about prevention today, that's a lot of what we're going to be doing. And then finally, if we were able to predict, and we can't predict yet necessarily who's going to develop the disease or when that first amyloid starts to accumulate, we might be able to intervene very, very early on. All right, let's talk about some risk factors. So we now consider that there's really a lifespan of risks for Alzheimer's disease. We're born with certain genes. For example, there's this ApoE4 gene. If you have one or two copies of it, you're at increased risk. You don't necessarily get Alzheimer's disease, but you are at increased risk for the disease. But people even without ApoE4 can get Alzheimer's disease. There are other familial factors that we have not yet been able to sort out when you see Alzheimer's disease in families. I will point out that the inherited forms of Alzheimer's disease, what they call the dominant form, where half the family might have Alzheimer's disease, is quite rare. And so even when you have Alzheimer's disease in the family, most often it's a very late onset in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. And the type of Alzheimer's disease is not directly genetically transmitted, but there may be some familial risks. We go throughout our life and then eventually may hit the point of dementia. And there are both risk factors and protective factors throughout our life. So some of those risk factors include things like unhealthy diet, alcohol misuse, poor sleep, smoking, diabetes. In midlife, obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. Of course, at any point in life, you can have neuronal damage. That is, concussions, for example, may increase the risk for Alzheimer's, as well as a different type of dementia called traumatic encephalopathy. There are vascular insults or strokes that can take place throughout one's life. But there are also protective factors, and we're going to focus on some of those today. So early life education turns out to be quite beneficial, as well as education throughout one's life. Cognitive and social activity. We are social animals, and being social is important. Having physical activity throughout one's life, eating a healthy diet, and then certain people have a resilience or certain brain factors so that even sometimes when they have some of the changes of Alzheimer's disease in their head, they don't really show it clinically, and we don't really yet understand what those resilience factors are. Of all these risks, about a little more than a third is potentially modifiable. So that's quite a lot. So we really can do a lot ahead of time, maybe to prevent dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Now, I will point out that all those drugs we talked about that start late in the course of the disease or at the mild cognitive impairment stage, since 1996, the graph goes from 98, but I mentioned that in 1996, donepezil was approved. There are a total of 4 approved medications for the disease. All are symptomatic treatments. You can see that none have been approved in the last 5 years or so, and the one that was approved 5 years ago was just a combination of 2 others. So most of the approvals now are over 15 years old. 146 drugs have failed, and if you were reading the news last week, it's at least 147, unfortunately. So the drug interventions from Alzheimer's disease has been a very, very difficult road. And so maybe there's another way we can go about this, but not waiting for the disease to already take hold of us. Well, we like a smart pill for our brain, right? Nobody likes medicines, but they want to take a pill, right? So, and unfortunately, and we don't have the time to go through this today, although I've spoken about supplements to the Alzheimer's Association, none of the supplements really have great evidence behind them. So I like the little guy with the raising the weights for your brain, but I wouldn't recommend any of these. All right, so unfortunately we have to be more proactive, and let's talk a little bit about the evidence of various types. We're going to talk about exercise, we're going to talk about cognitive and social activities, diet, and sleep. So exercise. So each time I'll present a little evidence about the background of the disease and a background of the intervention and how it makes a difference. In this study, they looked at exercise intervention, and they put people in an MRI scanner, and if you do that, we get very, very high quality images. You can measure, actually physically measure on the image, different parts of the brain, and you can track that over time. And so in this study, they tracked the hippocampus, and you can see there's a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow over the hippocampus, and it's on the inner part of the temporal lobes. Over here, yellow on the inner part of the temporal lobe. And that structure is really intimately linked to memory, and many studies now have shown that as memory loss progresses, as dementia progresses, that structure will shrink, and is one of the things that doctors can sometimes see on the MRI scan in people who are developing Alzheimer's disease. Well, they took people and they had an exercise group and a control group. No exercise, just kind of stretching. And they followed them over the course of a year. And they show here the plots on the left hippocampus and the right hippocampus, what happened to people. And this was really not very much exercise, about 40 minutes per week. Took about 60 people at an average age of 67 and a half versus 60 people at a similar average age, and looked at the exercise group and the no exercise group. And what you're finding here is that in blue, this top, the size of this hippocampus seemed to actually be increasing slightly in the group that was doing the exercise and decreasing slightly in the group that was not doing the exercise. There was a recent set of articles, I think last week in the lay press, that they have discovered that the adult brain can actually make new nerve cells, what's called neurogenesis. So this finding is in line with that. There are growth factors released in exercise, so it's not just that your cardiovascular system is improved, but what's called brain-derived neurogrowth factor is released. And so there are a lot of mechanisms that may help build up the brain and build up parts of the brain related to memory in people who exercise consistently. Now, what's the evidence of this when looked at over groups? So they took a group of people, about 1,500, a little bit less than 1,500 out of 2,000, who were in a cardiovascular study, and their average age was 50, and they were followed till their early 70s. And in this study, they were asked about exercise. So we'll talk a little bit about how studies are done a little later in my talk, but in this case, they didn't make people exercise, they asked them about it, and to document how much exercise they had been doing, then they periodically went back and asked them about their exercise. And then over time, they looked at whether those people developed dementia or not. And they found that the people who said that they exercised regularly for at least 20 or 30 minutes at a moderate level, those people had a risk of dementia. That was about half of the population that said they did not exercise, and about a little more than a third of people who went on to develop Alzheimer's disease. So exercise clearly seems to have a benefit in this population. Another study was done similarly, again, self-report of a whole variety of exercises. It could be walking, it could be calisthenics, and so on. Followed them up over time, and the rate of people developing dementia was about a third in people who exercised more than 3 times a week versus people who did not. So 13 out of 1,000 versus nearly 20 out of 1,000. If you took all the studies, or a number of the studies, where exercise was tracked over time, and you said, you know, how good was the exercise? Did it help prevent the development of dementia? And you plotted that out, and you looked at the risk of dementia off here on the right, and off here on the right. Most of the studies favored physical activity as a preventative of dementia, and the circle here is kind of the overall average of all these studies. And so overall, regular exercise seemed to be associated with a reduced risk of dementia. And again, these were studies where people weren't necessarily told to go and exercise, but reported what they did. And similarly, if we looked at not just dementia, but the development of Alzheimer's disease, there is a reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease over a number of studies in the case of people exercising regularly. Well, our summary is that reported exercise, so people reporting what they do, appears to improve cognitive abilities, and it lowers the risk of dementia, but what we call the, I guess, the gold standard in medicine, the randomized controlled trial, where you take one group and you do one intervention and a different group, a different intervention or not that intervention. Those have not been done, or there are not enough of them yet to make a clear statement. How much exercise do you need? Well, other studies have said about 2.5 hours a week, about 150 minutes. Although studies have looked at a range between 40 and 225 minutes a week. We think that having the exercise be a little bit vigorous is better than just kind of walking along at a window shopping pace, shall we say. So you have to have a little bit of breathlessness, a little bit of sweating. I was talking to someone yesterday who says, I don't like to sweat. Once I sweat, I stop walking. So that's likely to be not as effective as having a little bit of sweat. And of course, check with your physician before starting an exercise program, and don't launch off into training for the marathon tomorrow. So just walking 10, 15 minutes and building up over time really is the way to go, because you don't want an injury to really stop your progress right off the bat. All right, let's talk a little bit about diet. This is the food pyramid for a Mediterranean-type diet. And you'll notice on the bottom, the things that you should eat the most of are things like fruits and grains and vegetables. Next are fish, ocean-swimming fish and seafood, poultry, chicken, eggs above that, and meat and donuts at the top. So you don't need too many donuts. All right. So the Mediterranean diet, what is that? So high consumption with olive oil being the principal oil, legumes, whole grains, fruits and vegetables. Brightly colored fruits and vegetables have a lot of good antioxidants and so on in them. Moderate to high consumption of fish, some dairy products, Chicken, for example, is good, but red meat, meat products, and sweets not so good. In the Mediterranean diet, people, have up to about a glass of wine or its equivalent per day, and that seems to be beneficial. Although I will say that there are a number of other studies now showing that excessive alcohol use, or alcohol use really beyond one glass of wine or equivalent for women, 2 for men a day, may be detrimental in the long run. There's another diet called the DASH diet. DASH stands for Dietary Approach to Systolic Hypertension. So it was a diet created to try to reduce high blood pressure, and it emphasizes similar types of foods as well. And then finally, there has been recent interest in something called the MIND diet. Mediterranean Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. That's a mouthful. But that came up from Rush in Chicago. Martha Claire Morris has done a lot of that research. And she combined the Mediterranean and DASH diets to try to pick the most brain-healthy foods. And so she's looked at, if you ask people what they eat and follow that over time, and score that, and you can ask people what they eat and log it against what's typical Mediterranean diet, typical DASH, and typical MIND diet, and see whether that makes a difference in the development of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So she followed a little over 900 participants for 4.5 years, and people were assessed by this food questionnaire, and I'll show you something similar to it on the next slide, and she compared all 3 diets. So the MIND diet, Mediterranean DASH Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay, very similar to the Mediterranean and DASH diet, but it focuses on foods where there's some evidence that they may be a little more brain healthy. So for example, rather than just fruits in general, focuses on berries, because there have been some studies suggesting that berries may be more helpful for the brain than just eating an orange, for example. More green leafy vegetables, a little bit lower dairy consumption and potato consumption, and not as high fish. It's not that fish isn't good for you, it is good, but it turned out that eating it several times a week didn't make a difference over eating it a couple times a week. All right, so here is what their food monitoring food log looked like, and let me point that out here. So on the left are the various dietary components, and then there are 3 columns, 0, 0.5, and 1. And what you'll find under each column is what you have to do to get the points. If you follow the diet to the letter, you can get up to 15 points per week. If you don't follow it at all, 0 points. And you'll see things like, for example, the things that are good for you, green leafy vegetables, the more of those you eat a week, the better, right? So 2 servings a week or less get you no points, 6 servings a week or more get you 1 point, and so on throughout the other items on the list. There are things that are not so good for you. So the more of those you eat, the less points you get. So having red meat every meal, no points, but having it less than 4 times a week, you get a point for that. Wine, again, a little bit unclear, and so on, and of course not too many donuts again. All right, so what if we follow this over time and we measure how many points people are getting week by week, and then track them and see whether they develop problems with their thinking and dementia. So in the Mediterranean diet, people who followed it the most closely, what we'll call T3 here, or tertile 3, and you can see in the dotted line way at the top here, they have about half the risk, the relative risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is half of that who didn't follow the diet well at all, that T1. So T3 has a lot of points, 35 to 46. T1, not so many points. Nobody follows it perfectly, right? Nobody hits a score, very few would get all the points. And so just following it pretty well is good for your brain. And the closer you follow it, the more you follow it, the better it is. And so the kind of middle group there has a little bit less risk of developing Alzheimer's, but not as much less risk as if you follow it more closely. Similar kind of graph for the DASH diet, and similar type of graph for the MIND diet. So all these diets are very, very similar in their character and what they emphasize. The more you follow them, the better it is, but you have to do it over time. So, eating a salad today for lunch is great, but then, eating pizza or donuts for the rest of the week, not so great. So you have to be consistent in what you do over time. And as I said, these are lifestyle interventions, so you're kind of in them for the long haul. All right, so the basic summary for diet: adherence to these types of diets appear to have benefits for your cardiovascular health. They also reduce the risk of dementia, and we think that the more you adhere to them, the better over time. And you have to do this over time. All right, some other lifestyle interventions. Let's talk a little bit about cognitive training and other leisure activities and social activities. So they did a study where they looked at the amount of kind of thinking activities to do and how much brain amyloid was present in people's brains. And so 65 subjects were asked to be in the trial, and they were asked again about their participating in cognitively stimulating activities, such as reading books or newspapers, writing letters, going to the library, and so on. And then they underwent brain scanning to measure this amount of amyloid in the brain. These types of scans are actually clinically available now. They are not usually done except in the research context, because they're expensive, and unfortunately insurance does not cover them. But we are using these types of scans to screen people for research studies. So here is a negative scan and a positive scan. This was not people in the study, but this is just to illustrate what the scans look like. And you can see in the negative scan, there is very little of these kind of bright reddish and orange colors towards the outside, the cortex. There is some towards the middle of the brain of this amyloid, and that's normal. And in the positive scan, there's a lot more of those yellow-red colors towards the cortex or outside of the brain. And this will show an increased accumulation of amyloid. And that's a typical kind of scan you might see in someone with Alzheimer's. Well, we can take these scans and we can set a student off to go measure things and measure the amount of amyloid in different parts of the brain. So let me show you this graph. Here we go. Let's focus on the young control, so people who were young, like in their 30s. And if you do their brain scan, you find out they have very little amyloid, which is what we expect, right? When you're very young, you've not started to accumulate any of that amyloid yet. We can also look at the Alzheimer's group. So if you look at a group of people with Alzheimer's disease, they tend to have a lot of amyloid, as you expect, because that's how the disease starts. But then there are these middle group, and this was people in the study. So it turns out the more cognitive activity you did over time, the lower your amyloid levels were over time. And the lower amount of cognitive activity you did, the higher levels. So we can influence this amyloid as it's building up in the brain. It doesn't just go in there and get set and stuck, but there's kind of a dynamic relation to it. And the more healthy things we do, the less gets deposited over time, and vice versa. So there was a big study that looked at actual intervention of cognitive training over time. This was called the ACTIVE trial. It studied 2,800 people or so, and they did various types of brain training to see what would be most beneficial over time. So you could have memory training. So there were various memory strategies that they gave to people. You could do reasoning training, problem solving and pattern recognition, and you could do speed of processing training, for example, visual search skills, and doing tests of divided attention and so on. And they looked over time, their main outcomes in the trial were how your thinking skills were. So the trial really wasn't focused on dementia per se, but it looked at whether it made a difference to people's thinking skills over time and their ADLs, their activities of daily living over time in the study. Here's a schematic for how it was organized. So people started out at baseline. They could either not do anything. This was the control group. They had memory, reasoning, or speed training, and they had about 10 hours of training over 5 or 6 weeks or so. Then they could get assessed. Then at 11 months, they could either have some booster training, so more of their whatever particular kind of training they were doing or not, and then some more assessments at a year or two, and then finally at nearly 3 years, again get another booster and get reassessed over time, and they reported out how people did over time in the study. So what did they find? So they found that if you trained in memory, you were good in memory. So the effect size is kind of how much of an effect something has. An effect size of 0.2 is a little bit, 0.46 is kind of medium, and 1.46 would be a pretty fair size effect size. And so they found that if you trained in memory, you were better on memory tests. And if you trained in reasoning, you were better on reasoning tests. And if you trained on the speed of processing, you were better on these speed tests. But it didn't generalize. So if you trained in memory, you were no better in reasoning and no better in your speed of responding. If you trained in reasoning, again, no better in memory, and so on. So you were better on the thing you trained in, but it didn't help you in general in the rest of your life, okay? So booster sessions helped. There was a maintenance of improvement with just, not too much effort over a few weeks for at least 2 years. But when they checked people at this sort of 2-year mark, there was no real difference in their daily functioning or their everyday problem solving. So then they went back and they said, well, what's going on in 5 years? Now people have been in this for 5 years, they've had some booster sessions, and they found that, again, there was a maintenance within each trained domain, but only for that domain. The reasoning group maybe was a little bit better in their daily living activities, but there was no change at this point in 5 years in the development of dementia. And then finally, at 10 years, there was less decline overall in self-reported daily living activities. Speed training actually did seem to reduce the risk of dementia. And they didn't see this effect at 5 years because not enough people had developed dementia by that point. And the reduced risk of dementia was not seen if you trained on the memory test or you trained on the reasoning test. So part of the problem is, this seems pretty positive, right? If you do the speed training, people seem to have a lower risk. But when you're running a clinical trial, you have to focus on what you initially reported as the point of the trial. So the point of this trial was to measure their thinking and their daily living activities. It wasn't to measure dementia per se. And so while they found that in the trial, since it wasn't a primary outcome, they really couldn't make a strong statement about it. But overall, it suggests that doing things that are, in a sense, exercising your cognitive abilities over time, particularly if you did a broad range of things, it's likely to be helpful over time. So, in this case, they asked people again about what kinds of cognitive and social activities they were engaged in, and then followed them up over 7 years' time. Again, they're assessing this like interviewing people, sitting people down and say, what did you do and how much of this did you do over time? And there were different things that people could do, and I'll kind of break out this complicated slide. So let's look here at mental activity. So things like reading and writing and studying and doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku and so on. And if you look here in the, right over here, if you really didn't do much of this, what they call no, then there was no, obviously if you're not doing the activity, there's no influence over time. But if you're doing it daily, the relative risk of developing dementia and Alzheimer's was half. Okay, so doing these kinds of things daily, half the risk when you were followed over time. Similarly, if you're active physically, and we've already discussed the exercise part of this, if you're active physically, about 40% of the risk, and that was similar to the other studies I told you about. If you do social activities, go out to the theater with friends, you play cards with your groups, about 60% of the risk over time. Other productive types of activities, gardening, housekeeping, and so on, 60% of the risk. But what they call here recreational activities, or more passive types of activities, sort of watching TV, listening to the radio, and so on, where you're not sort of actively participating and being engaged with people. Not that it was bad for you, but it didn't seem to make, the more you did of that, didn't seem to make a difference over time. So these other things, where there's kind of an active mental engagement and an active social engagement, that's what seemed to make the difference over time. So I'm just pointing out here that we don't quite know. So people always say, Doc, should I do the crossword puzzles or the Sudoku? Is it enough? What about this brain training stuff? I have an app on my iPhone, I can do that and kill the, asteroids or whatever. And, so they created an app for these things, right? So the Lumosity app was where you had a variety of games that they said helped your brain training, and then they would assess you. And the Lumosity training was said to have a variety of benefits, improved attention deficit disorder, warded off Alzheimer's disease, it helped patients with all sorts of neurological and medical problems, and it could sharpen your skills in daily life. The games are designed by neuroscientists. Neuroscientists are nice, I know them, they're not a lot of fun, but I guess they're good with games. But it turns out that it really didn't make any difference. So doing these kind of app training things really was not beneficial, and they fined the company a lot of money. So that didn't work out. So when you say, what is it that you should do for training, we don't know yet. And what I would say is people need to live their life to the fullest. So don't do one thing, because what your brain is very good at is it very good at figuring out how to do as little work as possible, right? Because once you figure something out, you try to do it in the most economical way. So you really have to challenge yourself all the time, right? So if you ran 100 yards after doing that 100 days, it'd be very easy to run 100 yards, and you have to, go farther and farther and farther. And the same thing is true when you're exercising the brain. And when they study people or other animals, and they put them through tests or mazes, what they find out is that as the brain figures things out, there's actually less activity over time. And that's why we really have to challenge ourselves in a new way. And it's why social activity, you think, why does social activity fit into all this? And that's because interacting with others can be challenging. You have to respond to what they're saying, you have to be thoughtful and think about what someone's discussed with you and interact with them in both intellectual and emotional ways, and that exercises your brain. Okay, so summary of social leisure activities. All sorts of activities can be beneficial in reducing the risk of dementia. They may affect some of the biological markers, so being intellectually engaged may over time reduce the deposition of amyloid, for example. But we can't recommend a specific training program. And I have to say, more research is being done. I think there are brain training programs that may eventually prove themselves to be useful in the long term, but that work remains to be done. All right, now what about finding sleep? So sleep disorders have a number of biological effects. Sleep apnea, as you may know, is a risk for high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. And diabetes, and that increases your overall vascular risk, vascular burden to the brain, and things like strokes or mini strokes not only damage the brain themselves, but it turns out it increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease. In some people with sleep apnea, they may have low oxygen at night, and of course the lack of oxygen is in the long term damaging to nerve cells. And sleep deprivation may increase brain amyloid. Here's one of those amyloid scan pictures again, and what I want to point out is that people who get, on average, less than 6 hours of sleep, probably me, have a lot of amyloid, unfortunately, but people who got more sleep seem to have less amyloid over time. And that, again, that's a dynamic process. So you can always get more sleep and benefit your brain amyloid. The other thing they've discovered recently is that there's a whole, what they call glymphatic, kind of similar to lymphatic system in the brain that may help remove toxins from the brain and seems to be particularly active at night when you're sleeping. So there's a lot of consolidation of memories that seems to take place during sleep, pruning of synapses or connections between brain cells, and probably removal of some toxic substances that build up during the day. When sleep-disordered breathing was followed over time, there was a change in the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. Let me just show you these two graphs. So people have been followed in something called the ADNI study, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, huge initiative, many centers throughout the US, where people were brought in who were either normal, had mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease, and then studied over time. They had spinal taps, they had MRI scans, they had cognitive testing, they were asked about their sleep and so on. And so this was looking at people who reported or didn't report whether they had sleep apnea. So no SA is no sleep apnea, and SA is, of course, sleep apnea. And what they found here, it's a little hard to see the colors, is if you looked at the age at which people had onset of mild cognitive impairment, if you had sleep apnea, this kind of dropped off as you got older, meaning more people were developing mild cognitive impairment. And if you had no sleep apnea, it was taking a longer time to potentially develop that. So the mean age in people without sleep apnea is nearly 90, and in people with sleep apnea in the high 70s. That's a huge difference, and makes it show really worthwhile. Well, it is important to treat sleep apnea and do that consistently over time. When they looked at Alzheimer's disease, again, the people with sleep apnea were kind of dropping off sooner, meaning more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease at an age of 83 versus 88. Okay. So sleep summary, poor sleep may increase some of the biological markers of Alzheimer's disease. Sleep-disordered breathing may increase the risk of cognitive impairment and dementia, but it also increases vascular disease, and vascular disease increases the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And the recommended amount of sleep, and this of course varies by person, it's about 7 to 8 hours per night. Okay, so let's talk about level of evidence. We've talked about different types of interventions, so why aren't we either doing this all now, or how sure are we that this is beneficial? And so far, we really have, even though there have been these studies, they've been more what they call these type of retrospective studies, where you're asking people what they're doing, not assigning them to an intervention group and following them over time. And these studies where you ask people, as opposed to make sure they're doing something, are a little less powerful statistically and scientifically. And so the level of evidence, despite seeing this in many studies, is still limited. And we're engaged, and I'll speak about that in a few slides, in work to try to see what happens when people are really doing the intervention. But there have been a number of summary papers that said that there's no magic bullet, that when you look at all of this, we just don't have enough evidence yet. And so there's nothing that the U.S. Preventative Task Force hasn't made any recommendations yet as to what people should do. And what this results in is that as we get older, there's really very limited cognitive screening. If you go to your doctor for your Medicare annual wellness visit, I think they have you draw a clock and they ask you like 3 memory questions. But if you're not in that age group, you really get hardly asked anything at all. And that's because we haven't yet shown that there's a clear benefit for intervening, although we really think that this is the case. And the NIH conference said they couldn't draw any firm conclusions. So we've talked about a lot of potential benefits of these things, but we're going to speak about some ways people have tried to show that this intervention has more benefit than the past studies have shown. All right, so there are a number of confounding factors. So one confounding factor is we don't yet have these randomized clinical trials. We have these retrospective trials, but we really have to recruit people for new trials. And the Alzheimer's Association, I should put out, really promotes research, and that is super important. If you took all the studies that are reported in the national database of clinicaltrials.gov of people waiting for people to join them to try to figure out new things about Alzheimer's disease, I think there's about 70,000 people that are needed. And so participating in a study is really just so important. We don't know sometimes whether the factor causes the disease or vice versa. So you hear about depression, for example, being a risk for dementia. So is it that that the depression causes a dementia, or that as you're developing dementia, that causes depression. So we don't always know, unless we do these randomized trials, which way the causation is. There may be common underlying factors that we're not aware of. So if you exercise, you may just naturally eat healthy. So maybe it's the exercise, maybe it's eating healthy, we're not sure yet. And then, unless we do the intervention ahead of time, what they call prospectively, just seeing that two things are related to each other does not mean that one causes the other. And here's an illustration of this very nice tight graph of the per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by becoming entangled in their bedclothes. So looking at this, I've cut out cheese entirely. All right. So let's just go to this slide. So some dementia prevention challenges. Dementia pathology is very complex, right? There are multiple pathologies. We've just talked about this amyloid and tau for Alzheimer's disease, which you would discover if you did an autopsy and pathology. But when they actually look at the brains of people who die with what looks like classic Alzheimer's disease, they'll also sometimes find small strokes, and they'll find a variety of other proteins deposited in other pathologies. We don't know how all those interact at this point. So maybe you need multiple interventions to deal with multiple pathologies. Some people, as I mentioned earlier, some people are very resilient. They have a very significant brain reserve. And studies out of Rush, for example, have shown that some people die and were thought to be normal during life. They were clinically normal. They took care of their daily activities. And yet, when you looked at their brain, they had what seemed like Alzheimer's pathology, but they didn't have the clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So how is it that they resisted the effects of the underlying illness? And we don't know that yet. So the Alzheimer's Association and a number of other scientific groups have thought, well, we don't have the strongest evidence for these factors, but we think there's probably sufficient evidence to investigate them further and make some recommendations about them. And so what we call a life course approach, I showed you earlier on that slide where there are these protective and risk factors throughout one's life, and that's one way to think about it, that it's really not a single intervention or just taking a single medication, but you have to think of how to modify your lifestyle for the long term. So here again are those protective and risk factors, and let's talk a little bit about multidimensional interventions. So there was a study reported out in about 2015. It's called the Finger Study. It was done in Finland. And this is the Finnish Geriatric Intervention Study to prevent cognitive impairment. And what they did in this study is they recruited about 1,260 people. This was in Finland. And these were normal people. So when I say that cognition was at or slightly below mean, I want to emphasize that these were average folks. They weren't sort of super agers that you may read about. They weren't all, intellectual giants. They were just regular people who were recruited, because really, if you're going to intervene at the population level, you want to show that if you recruit regular folks and they do this, that their brains will benefit over time. Okay, and then they had a multidimensional intervention. So the intervention were things like they ate a diet that was high in fruits and vegetables and so on. They exercised regularly. They did some cognitive training on the web, and they also went to social sessions that were led by a facilitator. They had group meetings, and they were also given medical advice about managing metabolic and other vascular risk factors, okay? And this was versus a group that just got general health advice, but weren't specifically required to go through the intervention. What did they find? Well, at 2 years, they found that on a neuropsychological test battery, that people who consistently did this multidimensional intervention showed a 25% improvement in just 2 years. And for executive functioning, things like planning and reasoning, for example, an 83% improvement in the intervention group. Their processing speed was 150% better. Memory did not show a significant difference, but again, this was just at 2 years, and it's going to be reported out again at 7 years. The other benefits from following this multidimensional intervention is that you're less likely to develop other medical problems. So it's 60% lower risk of multimorbidity. That is, people who did the intervention, much less likely to develop 1, 2, or 3 additional medical problems of various sorts, just because they were exercising and taking care of their health. So overall, improved basal metabolic index, that's kind of like their weight was improved relative to their height, their dietary habits were improved, they were more physically active, and their cardiovascular system was better. Better on a variety of thinking measures, lower risk of developing other medical problems, and it held this effect regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of how they were at their baseline, regardless of this ApoE status, so even people who were at greater risk of Alzheimer's disease, they benefited, less risk benefited as well, and so on. So we're taking this now, and the Alzheimer's Association is a major sponsor of something called the Pointer Trial. We're participating in this up at Advocate in Chicagoland, and there are a number of sites throughout the country. And so Finland has a much more homogeneous population, shall we say, than the United States, where, it varies from, northwest to southeast and so on, very different cultures in those areas, very different dietary habits and so on. So what if you took that intervention and you spread it out throughout the country and you recorded both people from everywhere from underserved minorities and so on, and did this intervention? Would that make a difference? So the intervention methods will include physical exercise, nutritional counseling, this mind diet we spoke about, cognitive and social stimulation, and also improved management of health status. And people will either have what's called a structured activity, that is, they will be followed and made sure they do these interventions, or a self-guided set of activities where they'll be given all the information to do this, but they have to do a little bit more on their own. And we'll see if there's a difference between those groups. So more to come on this. They don't have results yet. That trial is just getting started, but I'm sure you'll hear about it in your communities. And what they want is they want people who have some risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia in their families, that they're currently kind of like a couch potato, but they don't want to be a couch potato. So if you're sitting on the couch but you'd really rather be exercising, then this is for you. If you're already training for the marathon, you're kind of doing it. All right. So what are some general risk reduction recommendations that we can take away from all this? Well, physical exercise, we've talked about the importance. We've talked about a healthy diet, mental, social, productive types of activities, the importance of sleep. Some things I didn't speak about today, but I'll put on my summary slide, is the importance of treating sensory deficits. I mean, none of us would think anything, right, about getting eyeglasses. We all do that. We wouldn't walk around. But getting people sometimes to have their hearing checked and to put in hearing aids is very hard. And the way to think about it is, you're taking in sensory information all the time, and your brain has to process it. But our eyes and ears are imperfect receptors of this information, and of course, if they're not functioning properly, it's even more imperfect. So your brain has to devote more resources to processing bad information. So if your vision is blurry, your brain would have to devote more resources to kind of, in a sense, sharpening up and interpreting that image. If your ears are not working well, your brain has to devote more resources trying to figure out, what did that person say? So treating hearing loss is very important. In fact, hearing loss is a risk for dementia, so I would encourage people to get their eyes and ears tested. Depression, very important to treat depression. There are a variety of ways, everything from counseling type of interventions to medications. Limit alcohol use. I probably go without saying, avoid head injury, right? Medications. So there are medications that have a certain property called the anticholinergic property. So things like Benadryl, which we sometimes use, or when you hear about like Tylenol PM, not to just focus on Tylenol, but that PM part is often a sedating antihistamine medication like Benadryl. And the more of these anticholinergic medications you have, the greater risk of dementia over one's life. So we don't encourage the use of those types of medications and supplements. Supplements, none recommended yet. We just don't have the evidence to provide any specific recommendations on supplements. Over time, and there are various clinics throughout the country that are also now developing a more personalized medicine approach. And I really don't have much else to say about this, except that they are focusing on what is your lean body mass, what is your BMI, what is your percent body fat, measuring biomarkers in terms of inflammation, lipids, genetics, measuring thinking, and then applying the real science that's out there to say, well, you look like you have a low lean body mass, maybe you should exercise more, or you have a high body fat, maybe you should lose some of that fat. And so trying to apply more personalized as opposed to general recommendations for prevention. All right, so implementation. So now that we all know what to do, that's going to be easy, right? Just you're going to get out there and exercise, eat healthy, sleep, but often there's a roadblock in the way, right? So we'd like to do all these things, but our brains kind of foul us up a little bit, and it's hard to often implement. Patients don't often follow doctor's orders. Many patients, there are some patients each year who leave the hospital against medical advice. Many first-time prescriptions are never filled. Imagine that is for high blood pressure or diabetes, for example. And then even when we know about things that are clearly been shown in multiple studies to prevent disease, such as colon cancer, we often avoid those screenings because you don't want to go through them, and it's a hassle, and so on. So there are a variety of ways where we can try to work on our brains to help us complete these various activities. We really like a supplement to make the brain stronger. All of this involves a lot of effort. So there has been a science of thinking about what are some of our psychological limitations that interfere with us implementing all of these strategies. People figured out, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for this, that there are different systems in the brain that help us make decisions, and that we pay attention to rewards and benefits and also punishments, very similar in the way that markets do, for example. People often don't act rationally, and even though you know that there are certain things that you can do that benefit with you, many times you don't act in your own self-interest. So Kahneman and Tversky showed that there, in a sense, are two kind of systems in the brain. One, kind of our intuition or fast decision makers, and is really how we make a lot of our decisions during the day, is automatic, and it governs most routine thoughts, because it's easy. And again, the brain wants to do the easy thing and make a quick decision. The system two, or reasoning through it, is reflective, deliberate, effortful, but because it takes that extra effort, we often don't engage it. Effective advertising often appeals to that quick decision-making. Physicians often don't. And that's why you listen to advertising, so people then end up smoking. And here's the part from the physician that appeals to the physician too, right? So here he looks great, and he looks healthy, and he's smoking. And the part that says this stuff is bad for you is in a little tiny print, and it doesn't make any difference. So, we think about that in how we structure these interventions. So there are a number of psychological limitations that limit how we implement things. There are 3 behavioral traits that affect our decision-making. What's called bounded rationality is the fact that we use mental shortcuts because we can't process. There's so much information coming in at one time. So if I'm looking out at the audience, people are moving, there might be someone coughing, someone's coming in through the back, there's, all kinds of movement going on. And if I had to process each of those individual stimuli, I wouldn't be able to, even go on with the lecture. There'd be just too much information. So we use a lot of mental shortcuts in making decisions throughout our day. People often choose the default. So for example, if you have to sign up for organ donation, very few people do that. But if people in some countries are by default organ donors and you have to decline that to get out of it, it turns out that then most people end up being organ donors. If you start out, and people are often anchored to initial choices, so if the only choice is the quart of soda, that's what you go for, as opposed to saying, I'll just take a little bit less of that. Other things, we have limitations to our willpower, so our intentions don't always translate into changing behaviors, and very often the costs and benefits are separated over time, right? So having that ice cream today tastes a whole lot better than going out and running in the cold. And so even though the running in the cold and the running over time, 10 years from now, you're going to feel a lot better than just having the high-fat food today. So making commitment contracts, highlighting the downsides and costs of things are important in helping us implement some of these plans. And then finally, social influence is just so important. We're really influenced by others. So if you're going to make a plan to go do something, find a buddy to go do it with you, or join a group. Being in a running group, or being in a card playing or a book reading group, and so on. It's having and thinking that people are waiting for you to be part of that group and join that really influences our ability to participate. There are a number of other ways to overcome obstacles, making concrete plans, again, seeking social support. There are, even on the web now, ways to make what they call commitment contracts. You can put some money on the line, and if I don't do X to improve my behavior, you lose that money. People don't like to lose the money, so they follow through. And then sometimes we have to link a challenging activity with a pleasurable one. So exercising and then getting a massage, for example, and so on, or having a smoothie or something that rewards us for our good behaviors. Other things, having goals that are smart, so specific and measurable. If you have a smartphone or an iPhone or Android, whatever, they have all sorts of apps that will measure now all types of behaviors, right? What your diet is every day, how much you're exercising. I mean, it's just built into the software on those things, and seeing that you've taken your 10,000 steps and logging that over time is a big reward. And so doing that with things can be helpful. Habits are the unthinking choices. Like, we started out thinking about something, but they became our kind of default automatic behaviors that we make every day. And probably over 40% of our daily choices and activities are really related to habits, some good, some bad. So there's a book by Charles Duhigg called The Power of Habit, and he talks about how to identify the cues, what your responses are, the routines and the rewards, and then trying to implement healthy routines in the place of unhealthy routines. So if you, in the middle of the day, go up, you go and get a donut, for example, and speak with some of your colleagues, maybe you're not really craving the donut. Maybe what you're really craving is just interacting with colleagues in the middle of the day. So substituting those routines may help engender healthy habits. Focusing when implementing an intervention, focus either on how much you've done so far or how little you have left to go, the smaller numbers. So at the start, emphasize what you have achieved, and towards the end, emphasize how little there left to do. So you kind of trick your mind in a way to keep you going over time. And set a plan, but be flexible, and always feel free to start fresh. So, even though you may not have done any of these interventions at this point, there is someone who said tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life, right? So you can always implement these things, and I think always make a difference over time. And then hopefully the roadway will be clear and smooth sailing. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions. I don't know if somebody's going around with microphones or how how you like to work that.
Dr. Do you have a list of all the studies that you referenced on a separate sheet of paper trying to see all of
I
them?
don't have it, it's in the slides, I probably could provide that.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Start at the front, second. Referring to one of your earlier graphs, what do you attribute the increase in rate to dementia to? Is it kind of identification, lifestyle factors, or environmental? What are your thoughts on that?
So when they actually look, the risk of you developing dementia now is actually lower than your parents. So we have better education now than our parents and grandparents. We think more about high blood pressure and other vascular risk factors. So the increase is thought to be largely the increase in the number of people who are entering that age, and the baby boomers, as they say, just quite a greater number of people, but not that the risk itself is clearly increasing, even though we just hear about it all the time.
Hi. As a healthcare worker, I get asked all the time, how do you diagnose Alzheimer's? And I know you mentioned, and I know there's autopsy, but you also mentioned...
That's a little late.
Yes, the MRI. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I know the cognitive is part of it,
So a lot of what we do in diagnosing Alzheimer's, part of it's based on, who is coming in for the assessment. Is that person 55 or are they 85? Because there are really different risks for the disease in those age groups. And then what we do, at a minimum, is we look for other causes of dementia. So the MRI, although you can do very sophisticated measurements on it, we don't usually do that. What we're looking for are strokes and hydrocephalus, extra fluid, tumors and the like, and things like that. We get basic labs. We make sure that people's thyroids are healthy and that they have normal levels of the B vitamins and don't have syphilis and things like that. And then we'll sometimes do more sophisticated thinking tests. So what I do in the clinic is sort of very simple-minded, just to kind of get a sense of people. You may have heard of the mini mental status exam or the MOCA or things like that. Those are very basic tests to just kind of get a sense of how people are doing. But if you want a more quantitative and detailed assessment, people have neuropsychological testing. So that kind of would tell me, is someone impaired? Do they have basic medical problems that are causing it, or are there strokes or not? So if that person was older, in their 80s, and they had none of those problems, but their memory was impaired and other thinking abilities, they're very likely to have Alzheimer's disease. On the other hand, if they're in their 50s, they're going to be much less likely, and you have to search for other things. So we can nowadays do a couple different types of other tests. So one is a spinal fluid test. So there's biomarkers in the spinal fluid. You can do a spinal tap, take the spinal fluid and measure something called amyloid, and you can measure this tau in the spinal fluid. And if it shows a certain pattern, that would greatly support the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Not as definitive as an autopsy, but very supportive. The other thing we sometimes do is what's called a glucose PET scan, or a metabolic PET scan. And that PET scan can show a certain pattern of low metabolism because Alzheimer's disease ends up kind of disconnecting the networks in the brain. So you'll see a low metabolism in what are called parietal lobes. And again, that's a supportive evidence for Alzheimer's. These amyloid PET scans, they've been done as part of studies, but we don't generally do them because of the expense. And now they're developing even those tau PET scans, for example.
A lot of it is still just ruling out other things.
Right.
Some of those clinical tests are
Other question? Yeah.
I have a question. In all your research that you were looking at, did you see anyone who was using resiliency training in your cognitive measures? Did you see anyone use that?
What do you mean by resiliency training, I guess I'll ask?
Okay, so for intervention, like the cognitive training for your brain that was in a lot of these, did anyone use resiliency training? as a measure to help with cognitive?
So I think there are studies that are doing it. I know people out of Nashville, out of Vanderbilt are looking at resiliency. It's very hard on the individual person to know how much for, one person is making a difference. So these studies, of course, were looking at groups of people. But yes, I mean, maybe the people doing the resiliency training don't end up in my clinic, right? So I only know the people that have disease and end up there. But yes, I think it's important. And that's what we recommend when people come in. Yes.
You mentioned the risk of routine use of Benadryl. Does that apply to all antihistamines taken routinely or just the Benadryl properties?
Benadryl, so I think it's more related to what's called the anticholinergic properties of the antihistamine. So Benadryl very highly anticholinergic, as are a number of other drugs. The newer antihistamines, fexofenadine and cetirizine and the like, are not very anticholinergic and probably wouldn't have those same risks.
I have a question about, have there been epidemiological studies looking for groups of people that don't have Alzheimer's versus do?
Yes, I don't have a lot of information about it. I know work out of Northwestern has looked at people that are called super agers. So people who in their 80s and beyond are performing as well as people in their 20s. So of course when people don't have dementia in their 80s, they may be doing very well, but may not be performing quite as well as when they were younger. But there is this group of people who seem to perform really as well as young people. And maybe they have more neurons, we don't know yet, but that is being studied. Yes?
Sir, in the finished study, you noted processing speeds, and I may have missed it earlier. Which psychophysical modalities, or did they do a compilation of all psychophysical modalities for the cognitive processing?
I'm going to confess to not remember the precise test they did at that. They often will do, response times and that sort of thing, but I don't recall a particular test for that study. Yeah. You want to have the mic so others?
Early on, you showed a slide about the percentages in the world of the population that was affected, and I think that Asia had the highest percentage, and I'm curious about that. Why Asia? I mean, their diet's a lot better than ours.
Not always. I mean, there are a lot of poor populations in Asia where the diets may not really be better than ours. I mean, they are better if you're fancy about it, but not necessarily. For some populations with high salt intakes and so on, they may have a lot of fish intake, but and not as much red meat, for example. But it isn't necessarily better than ours, depending on the population. They may not have as much childhood education and so on. It really depends on the country. I don't know that has been looked at, or I don't have that information in particular, but I think various parts of the world are more challenged in a variety of ways, and therefore this is not just a disease of first world people, obviously. It's throughout the world.
That's the same question I had about Asia.
Well, I don't have any different.
I do believe maybe a lot of the people there eat a lot of rice, and I think that can cause diabetes, and I think that was one of the markers or whatever.
Diabetes is definitely a risk for dementia.
Okay, and my second question was, I've read several times that people of higher educational levels may develop Alzheimer's. Can you speak to that?
Right. So people at higher educational level don't have a greater risk. They have a lesser risk, but they can seem to drop off more quickly. So it's as if they have some reserve, and there may be changes taking place in the brain, and at some point that reserve cannot compensate anymore, and they drop off quickly. So it's often found that people with higher educational levels, if you measure them over time, a little bit less risk for dementia, but when they develop it, it may seem more precipitous in that population, just because perhaps there's more, you know, when they say, for example, like in Parkinson's disease, by the time you develop the motor symptoms, 75% of the cells in part of the brain that give off dopamine have been damaged. So it may be, if you're resilient, that you don't show symptoms until 80 or 90% of the cells are damaged. But once that starts, there's so little reserve left that people drop off more quickly.
I'm hoping that you could comment a little bit more on familial factors. So you mentioned that with the exception of maybe APO4, early onset familial, that most of the time it's not hereditary in that sense. It's your belief these are things we just don't understand yet. I come from a family where my mother has Alzheimer's, her mother just died of Alzheimer's, her mother's father died of Alzheimer's, my aunt has Alzheimer's, but we don't have APO4, right? So
there's probably some other factor. I mean, it depends upon what the age of onset is. So there are 3 genes that are known to be dominant. The APP, the presenilin 1, and the presenilin 2. That accounts for about 50% of early onset disease. So people who develop disease in their sometimes 30s, 40s, or early 50s. There are definitely people, though, in those age groups, pre-50s, where they'll develop a disease and they don't have those genes. And then for older onset people, I don't think we understand, well, we don't. We don't understand, you may have a certain gene that you inherit that's a risk, but other genes may give you resiliency. How those interact, we don't know. So there's a gene called the TOM40 gene, and ABCD, and other inflammatory genes that seem to increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease if you measure them in large populations. But you could have that, but some other protective factor as well. So when I say it's not sort of directly inherited, I'm talking about what they call Mendelian inheritance, or these dominant versus, so for example, in heart disease, you may have high cholesterol but great blood pressure. So you might not develop early onset heart disease, or you might have terrible blood pressure. So, you know, those different factors interact in ways that are not entirely clear.
great. And if you could really quickly comment on, there was at least a couple of years ago a lot of press around blood tests that could more quickly or earlier detect Alzheimer's, whether that was microRNAs or that was certain proteins, RN something.
They're looking at amyloid and tau in the blood. You know, that is developing. So there are, I think we'll see more about this at this year's Alzheimer's conference and beyond, but they are developing ways to have blood tests that are simpler than maybe getting a lot of scans. I think you'd have to do sometimes those tests anyway, because even if you have high amyloid, it doesn't take away from the fact that you could have strokes as well. So one doesn't exclude the other. But there are developing potentially easier ways to make the diagnosis versus a spinal tap, for example. Yes?
Over here, Reverend.
Probably, is this the last one?
I think we've got 2 minutes till the break.
Okay, you tell me. Okay.
I was just wondering, have they done any studies with stem cells and Alzheimer's?
I'm going to say yes, but I don't have anything more to say about it at this point. So I'm certainly not ready for prime time, but there is certainly research going on. You know, it's a disease that affects widespread parts of the brain. So, you know, the question is, even if you fixed one area, you know, how would you fix those connections and things like that? How would stem cells make a difference in the amyloid accumulation and so on? So research is ongoing, but I don't have other information.
So you actually answered the last question already, so I think we're done.
All right.
We can be finished.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Just a couple quick announcements. We're going to take a break for about 10-15 minutes. You can join Fred Chavez for stretching and relaxation exercises in the courtyard. That's led by Oasis. And you can also visit the brain and resource tables. Also, if you haven't had a chance to actually check through your folder, if you take a look in there, a couple of the things that you're going to find, this right here is that bingo card. Visit all of the sponsors who made this possible. Check these off, and you'll be entered for the door prizes that are up on the stage here. This right here is an advocacy card. You want to fill this out, and this will help you advocate to end Alzheimer's. It is not a donor card. You're not going to be put on a donor list. You can put this in the basket that's right in front of me here. And also, if everybody can take a couple minutes at some point to fill out the survey. And then a few other quick things. We also have one person who left their lights on in the parking lot. And I'm going to read you, here we go. Honda Civic, it's grayish, CR7N660. So if that's you, then you'll want to check that out. We had a couple people asking about the hashtag that we're using for this conference. I asked, and that is hashtag #EndAlz. And then finally, we have some people that we thought would fill up all the tables, but didn't show up. So on your way back in, if you want to actually get seated at tables so you can take notes and all that good stuff, you're welcome to move up in that way. All right, thank you. We're going to take a quick 10-15 minute break here, and we'll be back by 10 o'clock.